You really think you're the only one who cares about this family? Jessica, Mom warned me you'd do this. She said you'd rather burn everything down than admit you're not in control. Keep digging, and you'll find out exactly how little you matter here. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Hi, my name is Jessica Reynolds. I am 33 years old. That was what my older sister said the afternoon I finally confronted her in the small office above the Hillside Villas management building in Boulder. Her voice stayed even almost bored, as if she were explaining something obvious to a slow child. I had not raised mine. I simply placed the printed ledger page on the desk between us and waited. Courtney did not look at the numbers. She looked at me the way she had since we were teenagers, with that flat assessment that always ended in her deciding I was the problem. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was at my desk reviewing occupancy reports for the 3 hillside properties we managed as a family. It came from an unknown number, no name attached, just a single line. Check the reserve transfers from March. They do not match the statements you signed. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to our family accountant, Owen Ellis, and asked him to pull the last 6 months of reserve account activity. He called back 2 hours later and said the transfers were real small at first, then larger, all routed through an account I had never seen on any report. I did not call my mother. I did not call Courtney. I drove to the office instead and asked Owen to show me the authorizations in person. He was 62, careful with his words, and he had worked with our father for 18 years before my father retired and left the day-to-day to the 3 of us. Owen slid a folder across his desk without speaking. The top page was a contract copy that should have been in the main file cabinet. It was dated 4 months earlier and carried both my sister's signature and my mother's. The second page listed a series of transfers totaling just under $120,000 to an account I did not recognize. Owen said the account was opened under a separate LLC that did not appear on any of our tax filings. I asked him how long he had known. He said he found the misplaced copy 2 weeks earlier while reconciling the reserve ledger and had been trying to reach me without going through the main office line. He also said my mother had called him the day before and told him to stop asking questions about the reserve account. She told him it was a private matter between her and Courtney, and that I would only make it worse if I got involved. I took the folder and drove to the first villa on the ridge. The property manager, Derek Hale, was there checking the irrigation system. I asked him if anyone had been using the small storage unit behind the main house for paperwork. He said no one had the code except family, and that the last time anyone had opened it was 2 months earlier when Courtney came up alone. I asked if he had noticed anything unusual. He hesitated, then said one of the long-term tenants, Laura Simmons, had mentioned seeing Courtney's car parked at the unit after dark on 2 separate nights. Laura had not said anything at the time because she assumed it was family business. I drove back down the ridge and stopped at the small cafe near the office where I sometimes met colleagues. Brandon Tate from the neighboring property group was there. He asked how the quarter was looking. I said steady. He said he had heard a rumor that one of our reserve accounts was under review and that someone was asking questions about unauthorized draws. I asked who was asking. He said he did not know the name, only that it had come up in a casual conversation at a real estate luncheon the week before. He said the person spreading it had used my name and the word irregularities in the same sentence. That evening, I went home and pulled every authorization code I still had access to. The reserve account showed 7 transfers since March, each one under the limit that would have triggered an automatic alert to all 3 of us. The destination account belonged to a consulting LLC registered in my sister's name alone. I printed the statements and the contract copy and put them in a plain envelope. The next morning, I drove back to the office and asked Courtney to meet me there after the staff left. She arrived 20 minutes late, wearing the same expression she always wore when she thought I was about to waste her time. I placed the envelope on the desk. She opened it, looked at the first page, and closed it again. Then she said the 3 sentences I wrote at the beginning of this story. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The contempt was already there, steady and practiced the way someone speaks when they have decided the other person no longer deserves the effort of anger. I asked her what the transfers were for. She said they were for expenses my mother had approved and that I was not on the approval list for that particular account. I asked why the account existed at all if it was family money. She said some decisions were made by the people who actually carried the weight of the properties, and that I had always preferred to stay on the outside looking in. I asked if our father knew. She said our father had signed the original operating agreement years ago and had not asked a single question since. Then she told me to stop digging because the only person who would get hurt was me. I left the envelope on the desk and walked out. I did not slam the door. I did not raise my voice. I drove to the small house I rented on the west side of Boulder and sat at the kitchen table with the rest of the statements I had printed. The numbers were clear. The authorizations were clear. What was not clear was why my mother had helped set up an account that excluded me and why she had told Owen to stop asking questions. 2 days later, another message arrived from the same unknown number. This one said, "Ask your mother about the call she made to Courtney on March 12th at 9:47 p.m. She used the office line. I checked the call log from the office phone. The call existed. It lasted 14 minutes. I asked Owen if he still had the original contract copy. He said he had made a second copy and locked it in his personal file at home because he did not trust the main cabinet anymore. That night, I drove to the ridge again and parked where I could see the storage unit. Courtney's car was already there. The light inside the unit stayed on for almost an hour. When she left, she did not look around. She drove down the access road like someone who had nothing to hide. I waited another 20 minutes, then walked to the unit. The lock was the same one we had used for years. I still had the code. Inside were 2 file boxes and a small digital recorder on the shelf above them. I took the recorder and one of the boxes and locked the unit again. I listened to the recording in my car with the windows up. It was my mother's voice and my sister's voice. They were discussing the reserve transfers. My mother said the amounts were small enough that I would not notice for months. Courtney said I had already started asking Owen questions and that we needed to move the remaining funds before I pulled the full statements. My mother said she would handle Owen. Courtney said she would handle me. The recording ended with my mother asking if Courtney was sure the consulting LLC would not trace back to any of us. Courtney said it was clean and that no one would look twice at a small consulting payment for property research. I sat in the car until the recorder battery died. Then I drove home and put the recorder and the box in the safe under the floorboard in the spare room. I did not call anyone that night. I did not cry. I made a list of every person who had access to the reserve accounts and every person who had signed authorizations in the last year. The list was short. My name was not on most of it. The next morning, I called Lucas Hayes, a private investigator I had used once before when a tenant disputed a damage claim. I told him I needed to know who controlled the consulting LLC and where the transferred funds had gone after they left the account. He said he could start that afternoon. I told him to be discreet and to send everything to a new email address I had created the night before. While I waited for his first report, I met with Emma Walsh, the neighbor whose property shared the access road to the ridge. She had lived there for 12 years and knew the comings and goings better than anyone. I asked her if she had seen anything unusual at the storage unit. She said she had seen Courtney's car there after dark twice in the last month, and that once she had seen my mother's car parked beside it. Emma said she had not mentioned it before because she assumed it was family business, but after I asked, she said she had also heard raised voices one evening when the windows of the unit were open. She could not make out the words, only the tone. She said it sounded like an argument that had been going on for a long time. I thanked her and drove back to town. On the way, I stopped at the small branch bank where we kept the operating accounts. I asked the manager, Thomas Reed, for copies of the signature cards on file for the reserve account. He printed them. My signature was on the original card from when the account was opened. A second card dated 9 months later listed only my mother and my sister. There was no record that I had been notified of the change. That evening, I received the first report from Lucas Hayes. The consulting LLC was registered to a post office box in Denver. The funds had been moved from there to another account in the same bank under a different name. Lucas said he would need another day to trace the second account. I told him to keep going and to send the next update to the same email. I did not sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the printed ledger pages and the recording timestamp. I kept hearing my sister's voice from the office, calm and certain, telling me I mattered less than I thought. I kept hearing my mother's voice on the recording, practical and unhurried, discussing how to move the money before I noticed. The following morning, I received another message from the unknown number. It said only your mother called the office again last night. She told Courtney you took something from the storage unit. I checked the office call log. The call had come in at 11:14 p.m. It lasted 9 minutes. I drove to the office early before anyone else arrived. I checked the main file cabinet. The original contract copy was gone. The ledger pages I had printed were also gone. Someone had been in the office after I left the night before. The only other people with keys were my mother, my sister, and Owen. Owen had already told me he no longer kept anything important in the main cabinet. I called Owen at home. He answered on the second ring. I asked him if he had spoken to my mother recently. He said she had called him at 10:40 the night before and asked whether I had taken any files from the office. He told her he did not know. She told him to stop helping me if I asked again. Then she hung up. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat at my desk with the empty file cabinet open in front of me and the digital recorder in my bag. The numbers were still clear. The voices on the recording were still clear. What was no longer clear was whether anyone in my family would admit any of it out loud. If your own sister looked you in the eye and told you that you mattered less than the secrets she was keeping with your mother, what would you do next? Comment your story now. I drove back to the ridge one more time that afternoon. The storage unit was locked. The code still worked. Inside, the second file box was gone. Only the empty shelf remained. I stood there for a minute with the recorder in my hand and the cold air from the open door on my face. Then I locked the unit, got back in my car, and drove down the mountain without looking in the rearview mirror. Lucas Hayes called while I was on the road. He said the second account trace had come back to a name I recognized. It was not my sister's name. It was my mother's maiden name used on an account opened 11 months earlier. The balance was just under $90,000. Lucas said there was one more transfer scheduled for the end of the week if no one stopped it. I thanked him and told him to keep the report coming. I did not tell him what I planned to do with the information. I did not know yet. I only knew that the numbers no longer added up and that the voices on the recording had stopped pretending they were protecting anything except themselves. I drove home from the ridge with the recorder in the passenger seat and the empty file box on the floor. The road was quiet. I kept both hands on the wheel and watched the taillights ahead of me without thinking about anything except the next step. When I reached my house, I carried the recorder inside, locked the door, and played the remaining files on the kitchen table. There were 3 more conversations. In the second one, my mother told Courtney that the consulting payments would look like ordinary vendor expenses if anyone audited the books. In the third one, Courtney asked what would happen if I went to the bank directly. My mother said she would tell the branch manager that I had been removed from the account for cause and that any questions should go through her. Courtney laughed once short and without humor. Then the recording ended. I made a copy of the files onto a new drive and put the original recorder back in the safe. Then I called Lucas Hayes again. He answered on the first ring and said the second account trace had moved again, this time to a personal account in my sister's name at a different bank. The balance sat at $108,000 as of that morning. He said one more transfer of $42,000 was scheduled for Friday unless the account was frozen. I asked him to send the full trace report to the new email and to copy Hannah Price, the attorney I had used once before on a tenant dispute. He said he would do it within the hour. I hung up and sat at the table with the printed statements spread out in front of me. The numbers were exact. Every transfer had been authorized under the second signature card that excluded me. The consulting LLC had no employees, no website, and no record of delivering any service to the villas. It existed only to receive the money and move it forward. I wrote the dates and amounts on a single sheet of paper and folded it into my wallet. Then I drove to Hannah Price's office on Pearl Street. Hannah was 48, direct, and did not waste time on small talk. I placed the statements and the signature cards on her desk. She read them without comment, then asked how long the second card had been in effect. I told her 9 months. She asked if I had ever been notified of the change. I said no. She asked if I had any recording or written confirmation that my mother and sister had discussed moving the funds without my knowledge. I said yes. She asked to hear it. I played the first conversation from the recorder. She listened once, then asked me to leave the drive with her assistant so she could make a copy under chain of custody. I did. She said she would file a civil action for accounting and temporary restraining order on the reserve account by the end of the week if the final transfer had not already cleared. She also said she would need to speak with Owen Ellis and Thomas Reed at the bank to confirm the signature history. I gave her their numbers and left. On the way back to my car, I received another message from the unknown number. It read, "The $42,000 transfer cleared this morning. Check the operating account. Your mother authorized it from the main line at 8:17 a.m. I pulled over and logged into the operating account on my phone. The transfer had posted. The memo line said vendor payment, research services. The authorization code belonged to my mother. I called the bank and asked for Thomas Reed. He was in a meeting. I left a message that I needed to speak with him about an unauthorized transfer and that my attorney would be calling as well. That afternoon, I met Brandon Tate for coffee at the same cafe where we had spoken earlier in the week. He looked uncomfortable when he sat down. I asked him directly what he had heard about the reserve account. He said a colleague from another property group had mentioned at a luncheon that someone was asking whether the Reynolds family was having internal issues with fund management. The colleague had used my name and the phrase possible irregularities. I asked who the colleague was. Brandon said he did not want to get involved, but that the name was Victoria Lang, a former business partner of my sister's from 5 years earlier. He said Victoria had left the partnership suddenly and had not spoken to any of us since. I thanked him and drove to the address Lucas Hayes had given me for Victoria Lang. She lived in a small house on the north side of town. She answered the door wearing work clothes and did not invite me inside. I told her who I was and that I was trying to understand what had happened to certain reserve funds. She studied me for a moment, then said she had signed a non-disclosure agreement when she left the partnership and could not talk about it. I asked if the agreement had been her idea or my sister's. She said it had been presented to her by my mother, along with a check for $25,000. She said the check was described as severance, but felt more like payment to stay quiet. Then she closed the door. I stood on the porch for 30 seconds before walking back to my car. The non-disclosure and the payment fit the pattern. My mother had used money to keep someone silent before. I drove to the ridge and parked where I could see the storage unit again. This time, Courtney's car was not there. I walked to the unit and used the code. The second box was still missing. The shelf was empty. I closed the door and stood in the cold air for a minute, listening to the wind move through the pines above the villas. Then I drove back down and called my mother. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was the same calm tone she had used on the recording. I asked her why the $42,000 transfer had been authorized that morning without my signature. She said the operating agreement allowed any two signatories to move funds under a certain threshold, and that I had been removed from the reserve account for reasons she and Courtney had already discussed with me. I asked what those reasons were. She said I had become disruptive and that continuing to question every decision was damaging the family's ability to manage the properties efficiently. I asked if she had told Thomas Reed at the bank that I had been removed for cause. She said she had informed him of the change in signatories and that any further questions should come through her or Courtney. Then she asked if I had taken anything from the storage unit. I said I had taken what belonged to me. She said I should return it before I made the situation worse for everyone. I ended the call. That evening, I received one more message from the unknown number. It contained a single line. Your mother called Courtney at 6:42 p.m. She told her you have the recorder and that you went to an attorney. I checked the office call log. The call existed. I sat at my kitchen table with the printed statements and the folded list of dates and amounts. The pattern was complete. The funds had been moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic flags. The second signature card had been added without my knowledge. The consulting LLC existed only to receive and forward the money. My mother had authorized the final transfer that morning and had warned my sister that I was escalating. The anonymous messages had given me the timeline and the locations. I did not know who was sending them, only that they had been accurate every time. I called Lucas Hayes and asked him to add Victoria Lang to his background check. He said he would have a report on her departure from the old partnership by morning. I called Hannah Price and told her about the latest transfer and the conversation with my mother. She said she would file the accounting action first thing the next day and request an emergency hearing on the restraining order. She also said she wanted to depose both my mother and my sister within 30 days. I told her to proceed. Before I went to bed, I played the recording one more time. My mother's voice was steady when she discussed moving the remaining funds. Courtney's voice was steady when she said she would handle me. Neither of them sounded angry. They sounded practical, as if they were discussing an ordinary business decision that no longer required my input. I turned the recorder off and placed it back in the safe. Then I sat in the dark kitchen and made a new list. This one had only 3 names at the top: my mother, my sister, and the unknown sender of the messages. Under each name, I wrote what I now knew they had done. The list was short and exact. I folded it and put it in the same wallet with the dates and amounts. The next morning, I woke to another message. It said the restraining order hearing is set for Friday at 10 a.m. Your mother already knows. She called the court clerk this morning to ask about the docket. I checked the court website. The case had been filed under Hannah Price's name. The hearing date was correct. I called Hannah. She said someone from the clerk's office had mentioned an inquiry from a woman identifying herself as Linda Reynolds. Hannah said it did not change anything. The filing was public record once it was entered. I thanked her and hung up. I drove to the office one last time before the hearing. The staff was already there. No one looked at me when I walked past the front desk. I went to the file cabinet. It was still empty of the documents I had left there earlier in the week. I checked the computer login records. My mother had logged in at 7:12 a.m. that morning from the office IP address. I logged out and left without speaking to anyone. On the way home, I received one final message from the unknown number before the hearing. It contained only a single sentence. Your sister told Brandon Tate this morning that you have been removed from all accounts because of suspected embezzlement. She said you took files and that the family is pursuing legal action against you. I pulled over and called Brandon Tate. He answered after 4 rings. I asked him if he had spoken to my sister. He said she had called him at 8:30 that morning and told him exactly that. He said he had not repeated it to anyone else yet, but that he wanted me to know before it spread further. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in the car on the side of the road with the engine running. The rumor had already started. My sister had used the one leverage she still had, access to the people we both knew, and turned it against me before the hearing. I drove the rest of the way home without turning on the radio. When I reached my house, I locked the door, checked the safe, and sat at the kitchen table with the recorder and the printed statements in front of me. The numbers had not changed. The voices on the recording had not changed. What had changed was that my sister had decided the next move was to make sure everyone else believed I was the one who had stolen from the family. I did not call my mother. I did not call my sister. I called Hannah Price and told her what Brandon Tate had said. She said she would add a defamation claim to the filing and request that the court seal the financial records until the hearing. I told her to do whatever was necessary. Then I sat in the dark and waited for Friday. The hearing was held in a small courtroom on the second floor of the Boulder County Justice Center. Hannah Price sat beside me at the petitioner's table. My mother and sister sat at the respondent's table with their attorney, a man named Marcus Reed, who specialized in real estate disputes. The judge was Elena Vargas. She entered at 10:02 a.m., read the case caption, and asked Hannah to proceed. Hannah placed the printed statements, the signature cards, and the drive containing the recordings on the bench. She played the first conversation from the recorder. My mother's voice filled the room calm and practical, explaining how the consulting payments would appear ordinary. Courtney's voice followed steady when she said she would handle me. Hannah then played the portion where my mother discussed telling the bank manager that I had been removed for cause. Judge Vargas listened without expression. When the recording ended, she asked my mother's attorney if he had any objection to the authenticity of the files. He said he did not. Hannah called Thomas Reed from the bank as her first witness. He confirmed that the second signature card had been added 9 months earlier without any notification to me, and that the $42,000 transfer had been authorized solely by my mother on the morning of the filing. He also confirmed that the consulting LLC had no documented services provided to any of the hillside villas. Hannah then called Owen Ellis. He testified that he had discovered the misplaced contract copy and that my mother had instructed him to stop asking questions about the reserve account. Hannah submitted the affidavit from Victoria Lang describing the $25,000 payment and non-disclosure agreement she had received when she left the earlier partnership. Victoria did not appear in person, but her signed statement was entered into the record. My mother's attorney called her to the stand. She testified that the transfers were for legitimate property research expenses and that the second signature card had been added because I had become difficult to work with on financial decisions. She said the consulting LLC was a vehicle she and Courtney had created to keep certain research costs separate from the main operating accounts. When Hannah cross-examined her about the recording, my mother said the conversation had been taken out of context and that she had been discussing hypothetical scenarios with her daughter. Hannah played the section again. My mother did not change her answer. Courtney was called next. She testified that I had removed files from the storage unit without permission and that I had been spreading false information about the family finances to colleagues. She said the rumor about embezzlement had originated from my own actions, not from anything she had said. Hannah asked her about the conversation on the recording where she said she would handle me. Courtney said she had meant she would handle the situation by having a direct conversation with me, nothing more. Hannah played the section where Courtney laughed after my mother said she would tell the bank manager I had been removed for cause. Courtney said the laugh was nervous, not amused. Judge Vargas recessed for 20 minutes. When she returned, she granted the temporary restraining order, freezing the reserve account and the consulting LLC pending a full accounting. She ordered both accounts to be reviewed by an independent forensic accountant within 14 days and required my mother and sister to produce all records related to the transfers. She also granted the request to seal the detailed financial exhibits until the accounting was complete. She did not rule on the defamation claim at that time, but noted that the public rumor had been raised in testimony and would be addressed at the next hearing. After the hearing, Hannah walked with me to the parking lot. She said the order was stronger than she had expected and that the recording had carried significant weight. She said the independent accounting would likely show the full amount that needed to be returned and that civil penalties could follow if the transfers were deemed improper. I asked her what happened next for me personally. She said I could choose to stay involved in the accounting process or step back and let the court and the forensic accountant handle the recovery. She said either path was defensible. I drove to the ridge one more time that afternoon. The storage unit was still empty. I walked the length of the access road and looked at the 3 villas from the pullout where I had parked so many times in the last 2 weeks. The properties were well maintained. The occupancy reports were steady. The numbers on the ledgers had been accurate until the transfers began. I stood there until the sun dropped behind the ridge and the air turned cold. Then I drove back to town and met Lucas Hayes at a cafe near Pearl Street. He handed me a final report. The consulting LLC had received $162,000 in total. $108,000 had moved to the account in my mother's maiden name. The remaining $54,000 had gone to a personal account in Courtney's name. Lucas said there was no evidence of any research services rendered. He also said Victoria Lang's earlier partnership with Courtney had ended after Victoria discovered similar small transfers that had never been explained. She had accepted the $25,000 and signed the non-disclosure because she could not afford a legal fight at the time. I thanked him and paid for his time. On the way home, I stopped at the small branch bank and asked Thomas Reed for a complete printout of every authorization on the reserve account for the past 18 months. He gave it to me without argument. The second signature card had been added on a date when I was out of town at a conference. The request had come from my mother's email address with a note that I had approved the change verbally. I had never given that approval. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with every document I had collected: the statements, the signature cards, the recording files, Lucas Hayes's reports, Victoria Lang's affidavit, and the printout from the bank. I arranged them in chronological order. The pattern was complete and documented. My mother had initiated the second signature card. Courtney had executed the transfers. Both had discussed how to keep me from noticing and what to do if I did. The anonymous messages had given me the timeline and the locations before either of them realized I was looking. I called Hannah Price the next morning and told her I wanted to step back from the day-to-day management of the villas. I said I would sign whatever documents were necessary to remove myself from the operating agreement and the signature cards. I asked her to negotiate a clean separation that returned my original capital contribution, plus a fair share of the undistributed profits up to the date of the first improper transfer. She said she could draft the separation agreement within a week and that the court order already protected the accounts from further movement. I told her to proceed. Over the next 10 days, the forensic accountant completed the review. The report confirmed $162,000 in unauthorized transfers. The judge ordered the full amount returned to the reserve account within 30 days, plus interest and the cost of the accounting. Civil penalties were assessed against both my mother and my sister for the improper use of the account. The consulting LLC was dissolved by court order. The rumor that I had been removed for embezzlement circulated for another week before Brandon Tate and 2 other colleagues publicly stated that they had heard the claim directly from Courtney and had seen no evidence to support it. The story faded after that. I signed the separation agreement on a Tuesday morning in Hannah Price's office. Sophia Lang, her associate, witnessed the signatures. The agreement removed my name from every account and operating document. It also included a mutual non-disparagement clause that prevented any of us from discussing the details of the dispute in public. I initialed every page without reading the financial exhibits again. I already knew the numbers. After the signing, I drove to the Ridge one final time. I parked at the pullout and walked to the storage unit. The lock had been changed. I stood outside it for a minute, then turned and walked back to my car. I did not look at the villas. I drove down the access road without stopping at any of the properties. When I reached the main road, I turned toward town and did not look in the rearview mirror. 2 weeks later, I accepted a position managing properties for a different group on the other side of Boulder. The work was similar, but the accounts were not family accounts. I met with tenants and vendors and filed reports that did not require my mother's or my sister's signatures. I did not attend any family dinners. I did not return calls from either of them. When my father called once to ask how I was, I told him I was fine and that I preferred not to discuss the villas. He did not call again. The last document that flipped the story arrived in the mail 6 weeks after the separation was final. It was a copy of the original operating agreement my father had signed when the properties were first placed in the family trust. An addendum attached to it showed that my mother had requested the second signature card 9 months earlier and had certified that both daughters had agreed to the change. My signature line on the addendum was blank. The certification was false. Hannah Price filed the addendum with the court as supplemental evidence. The judge noted it in the final order but did not reopen the case. The financial penalties and the accounting order remained in place. I kept a single copy of the addendum in a file at my new office. I did not show it to anyone. I did not use it to reopen any conversation with my mother or my sister. I had already removed myself from the accounts and the properties. The document confirmed what the recording and the bank records had already shown, but it changed nothing about the decision I had made. I live in the same small house on the west side of Boulder. I drive past the ridge, sometimes on the way to a new property I manage, but I do not stop. The accounts are frozen and under court supervision. The civil penalties were paid. My mother and sister no longer control the reserve funds or the consulting payments. Their reputation in the local real estate community has not recovered. People still work with them, but the conversations are shorter and the questions are more direct. I do not speak to either of them. I do not attend holidays at the house where I grew up. I send no messages and I answer none. The separation agreement and the court order are the only remaining connections, and those will end when the final accounting is accepted and the funds are returned. After that, there will be no legal tie left. I still keep the recorder in the safe under the floorboard, though I have not played it since the hearing. The anonymous messages stopped after the restraining order was granted. I never learned who sent them. I assume it was someone who had access to the office phone logs and the court docket, and who decided the truth mattered more than staying quiet. I am grateful for the information. I do not need to know the name. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table with the printed statements from the first week and the final court order side by side. The numbers match. The voices on the recording match the actions that followed. The last document confirmed that the request for the second signature card originated with my mother, not with my sister. That detail does not change what either of them chose to do once the card existed. It only confirms that the decision to exclude me was made before I ever opened the first ledger page. I chose the separation because continuing to manage the villas with them would have required me to accept that the second signature card and the transfers were ordinary business. They were not. The recording, the bank records, the forensic accounting, and the false certification on the addendum all showed the same thing. Funds were moved without my knowledge or consent, and both my mother and my sister worked to keep me from finding out. Once that was documented in a court record, staying involved would have meant pretending the documentation did not exist. I do not regret the choice. I also do not expect any further acknowledgement or apology. The financial penalties and the damaged professional standing are the only consequences either of them has faced. That is enough for the accounts to be protected. It is not enough for me to return to the same table and the same signatures. The hillside villas continue to operate under the court-supervised accounting. Tenants still pay rent. The properties are still maintained. I manage different properties now with different partners and different accounts. The work is steady. The reports do not require explanations for missing funds. When colleagues ask about the Reynolds family properties, I say the management changed and leave it at that. Most people do not ask twice. I still receive the occasional message from the old anonymous number, though the content has shifted. The last one said only that the final accounting had been accepted by the court and that the funds had been returned to the reserve account. I did not reply. I already knew the outcome from Hannah Price's office. The message was confirmation, not news. I keep the same routines. I review occupancy reports in the morning and meet with vendors in the afternoon. I lock the office at the end of the day and drive home without detouring past the ridge. The recorder stays in the safe. The statements and the court order stay in the file at work. The separation agreement stays in the drawer of my desk at home. None of them require daily attention anymore. My mother and my sister still live in Boulder. They still attend the same real estate events and speak to many of the same people. The conversations are shorter now. The questions about the reserve account have stopped because the answers are in the public record. I do not attend those events. I do not need to hear what is said about me or about them. The documentation is complete. The accounts are protected. The separation is final. That is the end of the story I have to tell. I received an anonymous tip, followed the numbers, recorded what I found, and removed myself from the situation once the court had done its work. I did not win back a family relationship. I did not receive an apology. I did not return to the properties or the signatures I had once shared. I chose the boundary instead. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever had to choose between keeping a seat at a table that no longer tells the truth and walking away with the documentation in your hand, what did you decide? Comment your story now